Hello, my sweet friends, and welcome to episode 1 of the Sundress Sew Along. My name is Becky, and I am so glad you stopped by. In today's video, we are going to be sewing this little cutie right here, and it is McCalls 7946. I absolutely love this dress. It is just so cute and so comfortable, but as a beginner, you're going to love how quickly it comes together and all the skills you're going to gain in the process. Well, there is lots of fun in store today, so let's get this project started. I like to keep my pattern pieces intact with all of the sizes that it came with in the pattern. And I use tracing paper that I get on Amazon. And you certainly don't have to do this. It is just my personal preference. Then I use cotton muslin fabric and just do a rough mock-up of the bodice portion of the dress, because that's where my fit issues come in, would be the bust line. This really helps in determining your proper size and also any adjustments that you may need to make before you actually cut into your pretty fabric. Based on my bust, waist, and hip measurements here on the size chart, it's suggesting I should cut either a 12 or maybe even possibly a 14. But this particular pattern has the finished garment measurements at the bust, waist, and hip included on the pattern piece. Depending on the type of bra that I'm wearing, I'm a 35.5 to a 36 at the bust line. And you can see, I knew if I cut a size 10, I was going to have plenty of room, because the finished garment measurements for a size 10 is 47.5 inches at the bust. You can see on the model here, there is very little space between the upper bust and the under bust elastic casing. The pattern tells me the elastic casing line should go here, but on my body it actually needs to fall lower to allow plenty of room for my bust line. And I'll show you how I'm going to fix that when we transfer our pattern markings onto our fabric pieces. The top of page 2 tells you how to decipher the pictures that are used in the layout diagrams. So I'm essentially doing C without the sleeves, and I want to add the straps from D onto this view here. So this is the view of the layout that I'm going to be doing here, and I won't need this side because I'm not doing the sleeves. Now my pattern piece tells me I should cut on this line here if I'm going to do view C or view D, but I don't want to cut all of that off. So I just fold that back on that line to have my pattern piece remain intact. And I didn't have to fold my fabric completely in half. I've got plenty of space for my pattern pieces, and I left 15 inches. I'm not able to get the entire layout on camera, but piece 1 is face down on the fold, piece 2 is face up on the fold, and then I have additional fabric that will come back and do the ruffle and the shoulder straps as well. And now just use a rotary cutter and a self-healing mat or scissors to cut out your pieces with your fabric. This fabric is what was left at the top when I cut out piece number 1 and 2 at the bottom, and I am using it to cut out the straps. On our pattern piece, you notice it says grain line. So you would simply measure from the top of your selvage edge to that line at each end. And it's 8 inches on this end, and it's 8 inches here as well. So that means it's all going to be nice and straight when I go to cut this out. This piece is not cut on the fold. You're going to cut all the way around on piece number 7. So I cut out my first 2 straps, placed this on my fabric again, making sure it was on the grain line, and then I'm just going to cut out 2 more. For the ruffle, my fabric is completely folded in half, and this piece is to be placed on the fold, And instead of cutting it for the shorter view C ruffle, I have simply folded it back along that cut line. We'll cut around 3 sides here, and I'm also going to do the same thing to cut another piece because we will need 2 of these for our dress. Now we'll be using several items from our sewing supplies section to transfer our markings onto our fabric. For these triangle-shaped notches, make a very small snip into that little triangle itself, just like that. And then for our circles, I'm going to be using tracing paper. It comes in various different colors. You can get this right off of Amazon, and I'll link that for you below. And I'm going to be using the blue because I think it shows up best on my fabric. My paper is double-sided. I'm going to put one at the bottom and one at the top of my fabric. And take my pencil and just gently rub over that area. You don't want to make a hole in your pattern, and it leaves these faint blue dots. Then I take my heat erasable pen and just go over the top of that, and that just makes them more visible when I'm trying to match up those dots. And now I'll show you how we're doing our placement line for the ruffle and also our casing lines as well. When I place the front bodice at the center fold down the middle and then put that under my arm there, that first casing line comes up way too high. I've got too much real estate in the bust area, and that is not going to work for me. When I go to that second casing line, that is where my first line needs to be. So I'm not going to use the first casing line, and I just measured and drew a new one at the bottom so I would still have those casing lines properly placed where I need them to be on my body. I am placing my tracing paper onto the top of my fabric. I've got another piece and I'm going to be placing it underneath the bottom of my fabric. And it does get on you. It is chalk, so I do keep a damp rag handy. And then I just gently roll my tracing wheel on top of that line. You do want some pressure, but you don't want so much pressure that you are actually damaging your pattern piece. And it leaves those faint lines, and then you would follow that same process to trace your other casing line and also the placement line for your ruffle too. So once you have all of your markings transferred, it's time to get our pieces sewn together. Place your front and back pieces right sides together, beginning with those notches, and pin or clip that into place first. Then make sure that your casing lines are going to match up with each other and pin or clip those into place. Then continue matching up those raw edges all the way down the rest of your side seams and pin or clip those into place as well. We will be stitching a 5/8 inch seam allowance down each side seam of our dress. You may find a seam gauge and a seam guide helpful in keeping those seams straight. First, you find the 5/8 inch marking and there's a small hole there. Lower your needle into that hole and then put your presser foot down. Remove the reusable tape from the back of your seam guide, and it has nice adhesive that's not going to leave a sticky residue on your throat plate. You simply press that up against the seam gauge and press down the seam guide. Lift your presser foot, roll your hand wheel towards you to remove your needle, and then you have a nice even guide to make sure all of your seams are straight. Place your fabric near your seam guide and put your presser foot and your needle down. You're going to have your needle down approximately 1/8 of an inch from the edge of your fabric here. Hold your threads and come forward 2 stitches. Back stitch to the edge. Hold your threads one more time. Come forward And then you can release the threads and continue to sew all the way down the side seam of your dress. And as you come to the end of your seam, backstitch a few stitches and come forward to complete your seam. And you'll stitch the other side seam in the same fashion. Then we're going to press both of our seams flat and then press each of those side seams open. Now it's time to decide how you want to finish those raw edges if you do not have a serger. You can pink the edges using pinking shears. You could stitch near the edge of the fabric and then trim that raw edge off near your zigzag stitch. Or you could do the turn and stitch, where you take the raw edge, you press it under, and then you stitch near that folded edge. And this is the method I'm going to use on my dress. I turn that raw edge under to the seam, then I press that down. And I've pressed those edges under on both side seams. And I position just the seam allowance under my presser foot and take the dress back underneath itself, so I am not going to stitch that down to my dress. And I'm going to stitch near the edge all the way down on that seam allowance, and checking from time to time to make sure that my dress is staying out of the way as I am stitching this down. I'm going to stitch each side of my seam allowance in that same fashion, and then we'll press this stitching down as well. So our garment will be nice and neat and tidy on the inside as well as the outside. The notions section on the back of our pattern envelope tells us that we need 7 yards of 3/8 inch elastic and 9 yards of 1/2 inch single fold bias tape. The bias tape comes out of the packaging with a lot of little folds there, so I just take my iron, lay it down flat, and then just pull this through so it lies nice and flat when we go to put our casing in. But before we start pinning down the bias tape to make our casings, we're going to go to the machine and temporarily stitch down our seam allowances so it doesn't get in the way and move on us when we go to insert our elastic in the casing channel. So adjust your stitch length to the longest length according to the directions for your machine. And we're going to stitch from just a little bit above where these casing lines are to right below. So that's going to be about a 7 or 8 inch section. Then after stitching, remember to set your machine back to your standard stitch length. Now take your seam binding, leaving about a 2 inch tail right at the seam here, and we're just going to leave that open for the time being. Place this with the bottom edge all along those casing lines that you drew in with your transfer paper. And you're going to pin that in place, and when you get to the end of each of your casing lines, leave a tail there on that end as well, and do that to all 3 of your casing lines here. And I placed my cutting mat inside my dress so it would help that bias tape to lie flat. So you may find a large book or something along those lines to be helpful when placing your casing and pinning it into place. I removed the back platform of my sewing machine, which then allows all of this area to be open, allowing me to sew in a complete circle. I'm going to fold this edge under right at the seam, and I want to stitch as close to this edge as possible. My machine allows me to move my needle either to the left or to the right, and most of the machines today also have that feature. Insert my needle into my fabric. I thought I was recording, but I was not. You want to come forward and backstitch to the edge, and then stitch slowly as close as possible to this edge, and stitch all the way around the bottom edge of your casing. And then as we come back around, backstitch a few stitches and come forward. We're going to leave this area here open. Now I've repositioned my fabric. We're going to be sewing on this side, and I'm going to move my needle over the other way now to get as close to that edge while I am stitching. Come up a few stitches, back stitch to the edge, come forward, and again, just take my time, slowly stitching close to that edge. And as we're coming back around, back stitch and leave that open. Even though I followed the directions, I think that's going to be too tight for me to get my elastic through. So I'm actually going to take my seam ripper and I am going to unpick some of those threads there. That's going to give me more room to put my elastic in, and I'm going to backstitch right here just to tack that down so it doesn't come loose when I am inserting my elastic. So I'm going to follow that same process when I stitch down row 2 and row 3 of my casings. And after you have clipped all of your excess threads, just come back and give this a nice press all the way around to make this lie nice and flat when we insert our elastic through these channels. We're now on page 3, instruction number 21, and that is for our shoulder straps. Fold them in half, right sides together, matching up your raw edges, and press. Then clip or pin those raw edges together after pressing. We will be stitching a 5/8 inch seam allowance, leaving this section open for turning. Come forward for 2 stitches, back stitch to the edge, and then come forward and continue to stitch until we come to the angled portion of our strap. Now there's a small mark on my machine here. I know when my fabric reaches that point that I can pivot at a 5/8 inch seam. So with needle still in the fabric, lift up presser foot and turn so your slanted edge is now on the 5/8 inch mark of your throat plate. And we're going to continue stitching. Before you get to the edge, do a couple of back stitches and then come forward to complete your stitches. And then you'll just do that same thing to your 3 remaining shoulder straps. Press all of your stitching. Then trim down your seam allowance. I am using pinking shears, but regular fabric shears will be just fine. And I'm just going to trim that excess off all of my shoulder straps just like that. Then we're going to turn out and press our straps, and I have 2 ways to show you how to do that. First, I'm using a loop turner that came in this sewing tool kit that I purchased from Amazon, and I'll link this for you below. And it has a hook and a clasp at one end. And you open the clasp, send it down the strap or loop you wish to turn, secure fabric near the seam allowance, then work the clasp through and close that up. And it does take a second to get that point worked down into the fabric tube. You gently pull on one end while you are pushing the fabric up and over itself. And then once it comes out the other end, remove your hook and then continue pulling your strap through that open end. And that is so quick and easy to do with this little tool. You can use a barbecue skewer if you don't have a loop turner and kind of open up your strap a little bit. Take the point of the barbecue skewer on the point of your strap, push it into the fabric, gently working that through. Then once that comes out, you can remove the skewer and then continue working that fabric down and over itself until it's all turned right side out. Then I'll use the blunt end of the barbecue skewer on both of my straps, working it to the end and then pressing out those corners of our strap. Just like that. Roll your strap until you can get your seam to lie flat and then press that down. And you'll do that to all of your straps. And now we're going to pin our straps, matching up the markings on the strap to the markings on our bodice. The small dot is on your seam side and your large dot is on the folded edge of your strap. And with your raw edges together, pin that into place. Using my presser foot as a guide, I'm simply going to stitch over the top of that strap, and this is just to hold it in place so it doesn't move on us as we complete the top edge of our dress. I then measured more of that bias tape, and I measured out enough all the way around the top of my dress, leaving about an additional 6 to 8 inches just to make sure that I have enough when I go to put this on my dress. Open up one of those folds on our bias tape, and we're going to press that all the way down so it looks like that after pressing. Now I'm taking my seam gauge and I'm going all around the upper edge, just making tiny dots at 5/8 inch because that's where we're going to be placing our bias tape. I'm taking my bias tape and the right side of the fabric with the right side of the bias tape going to go together, and you can still see the crease where you pressed that out earlier. And that crease is going to go at the 5/8 inch seam allowance mark. And pinning all the way around your dress. Just like that. And at the side seam here, I've left an opening and I have folded the edge of that bias tape back on itself. And now we're stitching right along where that crease was at a 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around our dress. Hold your threads and come forward a stitch or two. Back stitch to that edge. And continue stitching at a 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way down where you can still see that crease around the top edge of your dress. Then as you come up to the other side, take a few back stitches before you reach that fold and then come forward to complete your stitches. Just like that. Then you're going to trim down this excess fabric at the top to evenly match the top here of your bias tape. Just like that. And you're going to do that all the way around the top of your dress. Then press up that seam. Then we're going to turn it under, and that's going to finish the top edge of our dress. And then press that down. And then you will pin into place after pressing. And you want to make sure that you have just the tiniest amount of your fabric showing at the top. That way, your bias tape is not going to be showing on the outside. Now we're going to sew a basting stitch along the lower fold of our bias tape here, and I used black thread for contrast. I thought that would show up better. Take your sewing machine to the longest stitch possible. This time we will not be back stitching. We're simply going to sew very closely along that edge. Then when you've come back around to the other side, you want to leave a couple of inches of tails on your thread, and you don't backstitch here either. Then set your machine back to your standard stitch length, and then I'm also going to put my white thread back in when we go to stitch down our bias tape. Bias tape can get pretty wiggly. That's why we baste it into place first on the underside. Now on the outside, we're going to come back and stitch a regular stitching length just to the inside edge of our basting stitches. That allows us to make sure we are going to catch that fold on the bottom. Hold threads and come forward a few stitches, then back stitch, and then come forward. And again, we're stitching just to the inside of that basting stitch, ensuring we catch the fold of our bias tape underneath. Then as you come back to the other side of your bias binding, back stitch, and then come forward to complete your stitching. And it's easier for you to see on the inside how that stitching looks. And now you'll need your seam ripper and very carefully take out those basting stitches, making sure that you're only gathering up the basting thread. And I just take my time working in small sections as I go. And after removing the basting stitches, now just give that top edge of your dress a good press. Then you use pattern piece number 8, and it is your upper bust elastic guide, and you place that on whatever size you cut. I used a size 10, and then you cut that to the length suggested by your elastic guide. And then you'll use either a bodkin or a safety pin to send that elastic through your upper casing. You will need to use a safety pin to pin this edge in so it doesn't go all the way through your dress and then you have to start over again. And you just keep working your elastic through that upper casing. And I'm just going to go ahead and pin this edge and stabilize that as I am sending the elastic through the casing. Then after you work the elastic through, you want to try it on and adjust to make sure it's comfortable. I am going to take out a couple of inches, but I still have plenty of stretch so I can get this either over my head and shoulders or up my hips. Now you're going to overlap those edges of your elastic. And now I'm going to stitch back and forth from one end to the other here across the width of my elastic. And I apologize because I'm sure my hands are all going to be in the way as I try and keep this slightly stretched as I am stitching. And then I lift my presser foot and turn it, and then come back down this way and turn. And back stitch to secure. Work that elastic back through your open channel there. I'm going to take some tweezers and push those edges inside the casing. So then after you work that back through, you're just going to take some needle and thread and you're going to stitch that opening closed. it's going to look like that. Then you're going to take piece number 9 and you're going to cut 3 of these, and that is what you will then insert into your waist channels. And you're going to do the same thing to these channels as you did at the top here. And because I have already demonstrated this process, I will be doing this off camera. And after getting all of your elastic channels in there and everything stitched up on the inside, remember to come back to your side seam and use your seam ripper to remove those basting stitches along that area here. And now you'll need your ruffle pieces because we are moving on to step number 34. Place your right sides together, matching up those notches, and pin into place on each end. And by now you should feel confident in stitching a 5/8 inch seam down each side, remembering to back tack at the start and at the stop to secure those stitches in place. Then after stitching, press open your seams and finish your raw edges in your preferred method. Now we're going to hem the upper edge of our ruffle, and that is the side where all of your markings are located. First, we'll stitch a 1/2 inch from the raw edge all the way around the top of our ruffle. And there is no need to back stitch. Stitch that all the way around your top raw edge. Then you're going to press up that line of stitching, and you will press that up all the way around the edge of your ruffle. And then you're going to trim close to that line of stitching all the way around your ruffle. Then you're going to turn that edge up and press. That is going to create a small hem. Just like that. And then clip or pin that edge into place. And we'll be stitching close to this inner fold right here. Hold your threads and come forward a few stitches, back stitch to secure those threads, and then just take your time and stitch close to that edge all the way around the hem of your ruffle. Then as you're coming back from where you started, go a few stitches past that, back stitch and come forward, and then give your hem a good press. Now on the other end, we're going to press up a 5/8 inch hem, and you can use your seam gauge to mark that, but I am using my hot ruler. It's like a firm piece of felt that you can iron directly on, and I'm just going to pull that fabric up to the 5/8 inch line and iron that down. I love this little handy dandy tool. It really makes quick work of pressing up these allowances like this. And I will link this for you below since this came from Amazon. Then take this raw edge up to the crease and fold that up and press that into place as well. Go and stitch very close to this edge here all the way around your ruffle, just like you stitched in the top of your ruffle hem here. And then you'll press that hem as well. Now it's time to create the gathers in our ruffle, and that is the edge that has the smaller hem, and it also has your markings. And to make it easier to see, I did transfer my markings to the outside of the top of my ruffle first, and I transferred them to the outside of the bottom of my dress as well. Throughout the tutorial, I have followed the pattern mainly as it is written, but I'm going to do a little bit of a detour when it comes to our gathering stitch. Our instructions call for just one stitched gathering line, but I always prefer to do 2 gathering stitches because I just think it gives just a more finished look. Set your machine to the longest stitch allowed. Make sure you have tails at least 8 to 10 inches long. We are not going to backstitch, and we'll be stitching right along our gathering line that we marked with our tracing paper. That's going to be between 3/8 to a 1/2 inch on our throat plate here. And I'm using black thread to make it easier to demonstrate, but also easier when I go to remove these temporary stitches after we do our gathering. And we're going to stitch from one seam to the other seam on the front of our ruffle. Then once we've made our way to the other seam on the front of the ruffle, pull out another length of thread tails about 8 to 10 inches. Then once again, having about 8 to 10 inch of thread tails in your machine, you are going to stitch from seam to seam on the back of your ruffle, following that same process. And now that we are back to the other seam, we are going to again pull out about an 8 to 10 inch tail of our threads. And now I'm going to stitch another row of a gathering stitch 3/4 of an inch from the top edge of my ruffle. You don't have to do this, but I prefer it because again, I just think it looks more professional. Leave your long tails and stitch from one seam to the other on the front of your ruffle. Cut threads and leave tails at this seam. Pull out more tails and stitch at 3/4 of an inch to the other seam on the back of your ruffle. So then your stitching should look something like this. Now remember to change your thread back if you use contrasting thread for basting stitches, and also remember to set your machine back to your normal stitch length when we go to stitch on our ruffle. Now we're going to take the right side of the dress and match it up with the wrong side of the ruffle, matching up those large dots and pinning that into place. And then you want to match up your side seams, and it tells you to place your first line of gathering stitches on your placement line that we drew in with our tracing paper. So I did make a couple of little dots there, and essentially it is 5/8 inch up from this raw edge here, and you are placing that row of gathering stitches at the top where it matches up on your placement line, and then you'll pin your side seams into place. And with everything in place, we are going to pull our gathering threads from seam to seam on the front of our dress. But before we do that, we need to secure the end that we are not going to be pulling, so those threads don't come loose as we are trying to gather. I've placed a pin in there, and I am just going to do a figure 8 and keep wrapping that thread around that pin so it is not going to come out when we start to gather our ruffle. Just like that. And now we can come to the right side and gently pull on these threads, working the fabric over the threads. And as we do that, it begins to create more defined gathers along our ruffle. And you're just going to work those gathers all the way down from one end of your ruffle to the other. As a beginner though, you may find it easier for you to only have pins at the end where your side seams are, removing the pins at the large dots, and then just working those gathers. And after you've distributed them across the ruffle, then you can find your dots and match those up. It's probably a little easier for you if you have never done gathers on a ruffle before. Now our instructions tell us to baste our ruffle into place and then stitch, but I don't do that because I use lots and lots of pins. So now we're going to go and stitch our ruffle, and we are going to be stitching between these two lines very close to our top gathering line right here. I'm starting at the back of the dress on the ruffle near the side seam, and we're going to come forward a few stitches and back stitch and then come forward. We're going to remove our pins, and all of this thread that I had wrapped around that pin, I'm going to move up out of my way and then continue stitching and kind of holding down those gathers between my fingers so I can see my stitching line, and again removing pins as we go. And I'm going to slowly stitch all the way around, securing my gathered ruffle to my dress. And as you come to where you started, go a little past that, backstitch a few, and come forward to secure those stitches. To finish off this raw edge at the bottom of the dress where the ruffle is attached, I am going to use my pinking shears. That way it's going to keep this from fraying as I wash and wear it. So I tuck the ruffle inside the dress so only that edge is showing, and I'm just going to pink that edge all the way around the bottom of the dress. Now we need to remove our basting stitches, and I come to the middle of the dress ruffle, so I pulled a few of those up there. Then I can come to the seam, and those threads that we use to actually make our ruffles, we can just gently pull on those and work that all the way down. And as we do that, we can just simply pull these threads out. Just like that. Then we're going to press up along our stitching line where we made our gathers on our ruffle. And you can see how it makes that sit down a little better and not just flop over at the top. And now our dress is finished. I absolutely love this. Just so pretty. I cannot wait to wear this dress. I just love how this dress turned out. It is just cute and comfortable perfection. I am 5'1", and this turned out to be the perfect length for me. And I think it also looks really cute paired with these wedges for date night. And it's also great paired with a cropped denim jacket and some sandals to be comfortable while I'm out running errands. Thank you so much for joining me today. It has been my pleasure to sew with you. Please subscribe for more kinda shabby but always chic creative inspiration. And until next time, my sweet friends, be blessed.